From the moment she stepped onto the cafe floor each morning, she blended into the background so completely that most people barely registered her presence. She moved quietly between tables, eyes lowered, voice soft, posture careful not to take up too much space. To the customers, she was simply a waitress doing her job polite, efficient, forgettable. Her uniform was plain, her gestures restrained, and her manner carried none of the loud confidence that usually demanded attention. In a world that equated worth with volume, status, and display, she seemed unremarkable, almost invisible. What no one noticed was the mind working steadily beneath that quiet exterior. Every order she took was processed with precision, every request remembered without being written down. She listened more than she spoke, absorbing fragments of conversations around her, not out of nosiness, but out of instinct. Languages, accents, and expressions registered naturally to her, like familiar melodies. Years of learning had trained her ear, but humility had trained her silence. She did not volunteer her knowledge, because she had learned long ago that brilliance did not always invite kindness. Her shyness was not the absence of confidence, but the presence of caution. Life had taught her that standing out often came at a cost. Intelligence, especially when it exceeded expectations, tied to appearance or role, could provoke disbelief or resentment, so she kept it folded neatly inside herself, expressed only when necessary. To her, working as a waitress was not a reflection of her limits, but a pause, a moment of stability while the rest of the world rushed ahead with its assumptions. Customers came from all walks of life: tourists struggling with menus, business people speaking quickly into phones, families mixing languages at their tables. When confusion arose, she stepped in gently, switching tongues with ease, smoothing interactions without drawing attention to herself. She never lingered on the act, never waited for praise. Helping felt natural, almost invisible to her, the way breathing did. Each flawless transition between languages was simply another way to do her job well, not a performance. To those who finally noticed, the contrast was startling. The gap between who she appeared to be and who she truly was forced a quiet reckoning. It revealed how easily society confuses silence with simplicity and modest roles with modest minds. Her brilliance had never been hidden out of fear of being discovered. It had been hidden because no one had bothered to look closely enough. There was something powerful in that restraint. She did not use her knowledge to elevate herself above others, nor did she wear it like armor. It existed as a calm certainty, an inner richness untouched by the opinions of strangers. Her humility was not self-denial, but self-assurance and understanding that her value did not depend on recognition. In her presence, the idea of success became less about wealth, status, or spectacle, and more about depths. She embodied the truth that extraordinary ability often lives in ordinary places, unnoticed and underestimated. Her story was not about sudden transformation, but about revelation, the moment when others were forced to confront their own shallow judgments. She had always been remarkable. The world was simply late in realizing it. It happened without warning, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, when the cafe hummed with the usual mix of clinking cups and low conversation. Nothing about the moment announced its importance. She was moving between tables, as she always did, carrying plates, offering quiet smiles, speaking only when spoken to. Then a small misunderstanding arose at a nearby table. Tourists, confused by the menu, their words tumbling out in a language unfamiliar to most around them. Without hesitation, she stepped in, her voice shifting seamlessly, her tone gentle and confident. The confusion dissolved instantly, replaced by relief and gratitude. That was when he noticed. At first, it barely registered as surprise. It felt like a misheard detail, something his mind needed a second to process. He looked up from his phone, attention sharpened, eyes following her as she continued speaking. The language flowed from her effortlessly, without accent or pause, as natural as her own. When the interaction ended, she returned to her work as if nothing unusual had occurred. But the atmosphere around him had changed. A quiet curiosity settled in, heavy and insistent. Moments later, it happened again. A different table. A different language. The same flawless ease. This time, there was no mistaking it. What he was witnessing, didn't he align with the image he had unconsciously formed of her? The simplicity he had assigned to her role began to crack. Each word she spoke widened that fracture, revealing something deeper beneath the surface. The realization stirred something unfamiliar discomfort, mixed with awe. He listened more closely now, attuned to details he would have ignored before. Her pronunciation, her understanding of nuance, the way she adapted her tone, depending on who she was speaking to. This wasn't memorization or imitation. It was mastery. The cafe, once background noise, faded as his attention fixed on her. The moment stretched, becoming heavier with meaning. When he finally spoke to her, it was not out of arrogance, but intrigue. He chose a language deliberately obscure, one rarely spoken even among scholars. The question was casual on the surface, but beneath it lay an assumption, a test. He expected hesitation, perhaps a polite smile and an apology. Instead, she met his gaze calmly and answered without pause. Her response was precise, fluid, and complete. The effect was immediate and disarming. The power dynamic he was accustomed to shifted in an instant. For the first time in years, he felt genuinely unprepared. The confidence he carried so effortlessly wavered, replaced by something quieter and more honest. He was not witnessing a trick or a coincidence. He was witnessing truth. In that single exchange, indifference collapsed. The labels he had subconsciously placed on her waitress, background, ordinary, lost their meaning. What stood in front of him was someone whose depth he had failed to imagine. The revelation was not loud or dramatic, but it was profound. It exposed how little attention he had paid, how easily he had overlooked substance in favor of surface. She did not wait for his reaction. She nodded politely and moved on, leaving him with the weight of the moment. The cafe returned to its rhythm, but he remained still, unsettled and awakened. That brief interaction had pierced his assumptions and left something lasting behind. It was not just admiration he felt, but a quiet humility, an understanding that brilliance often reveals itself in whispers, and only to those willing to listen. For most of his life, power had been a language he spoke fluently. Wealth opened doors before he reached them, softened conversations, and shaped the way people responded to his presence. He was accustomed to being deferred to, listened to, and quietly accommodated. In rooms filled with ambition, his status spoke first, long before he ever needed to. It had become so natural that he rarely questioned it, rarely noticed how effortlessly the world bent in his favor. In the cafe, that invisible authority followed him in. The way staff moved a little faster near his table, the way conversations lowered when he took a call, the subtle recognition of someone used to command. He had not earned this power in that moment. It arrived with him, wrapped in reputation and assumption. To him, it felt normal. To others, it shaped behavior before words were exchanged. Yet in the presence of her, that familiar balance began to falter, not because she challenged him directly, but because she existed outside the system he relied on. She did not treat him with exaggerated politeness or visible nervousness. Her demeanor remained steady, respectful, and neutral, as if his wealth carried no extra weight. That alone unsettled him, though he could not immediately name why. When he tested her with the rare language, he did so unconsciously from a place of privilege. It was a subtle assertion of control, a reminder of his access to elite education and uncommon experiences. In his world, such knowledge was currency, another marker of distinction. The question was meant to re-establish hierarchy, to return him to familiar ground where he held the advantage. Her answer dismantled that expectation completely. She did not struggle or seek clarification. She responded with ease, precision, and confidence that required no validation. In that instant, the advantage he had assumed dissolved. His wealth, his status, his practiced dominance offered him nothing. There was no room to maneuver, no way to reclaim the upper hand without revealing insecurity. The reversal was quiet but absolute. For once, money could not buy context, preparation, or superiority. What stood between them was pure competence earned, internal, and undeniable. It was a reminder that some forms of power are immune to financial influence. They are built slowly, privately, and without spectacle, making them all the more formidable. He felt exposed, not because she intended it, but because the illusion he lived within had cracked. He had mistaken resources for depth, access for understanding. Her presence forced him to confront a truth he had long avoided, that his position in the world was not solely a measure of his intellect or worth, but also of circumstance. She, on the other hand, stood grounded. There was no triumph in her expression, no satisfaction in the shift she had caused. She did not need to assert herself because she already knew who she was. That quiet self-possession carried more weight than any display of wealth ever could. The power dynamic had reversed not through confrontation, but through revelation. In recognizing her mastery, he was also recognizing his own limitations. It was an unfamiliar and humbling experience, one that stripped away entitlement and replaced it with respect. For the first time, he understood that true power does not announce itself. It simply exists, steady and unshaken, waiting for the moment it becomes impossible to ignore. Respect had always been something he received automatically. It arrived with introductions, followed his name into rooms, and settled comfortably into conversations before he spoke a word. People respected his success, his wealth, the authority those things implied. It was an inherited reaction, conditioned by social hierarchy rather than earned through understanding. Over time, he had come to accept it as natural, rarely questioning where it came from or what it was truly worth. In the cafe, that expectation lingered quietly in the background. He was used to attentive service, to polite efficiency shaped by recognition. Yet when she approached his table, there was nothing performative in her manner. She was courteous but unassuming, focused on her task rather than his status. Her respect, if it could be called that, did not come from who he was in the world, but from the simple fact that he was a customer. It was impartial, evenly distributed, and therefore far more honest than he was accustomed to receiving. The shift came when he realized that his admiration for her had nothing to do with her role, and everything to do with her capability. Watching her navigate languages with such ease, he felt something unfamiliar take root. This was not the admiration that came from novelty or charm, but from witnessing competence in its purest form. Her skill demanded acknowledgement, not because it sought attention, but because it could not be ignored. What struck him most was her lack of expectation. She did not wait for praise or recognition, nor did she alter her behavior after revealing her ability. There was no subtle claim for validation, no attempt to leverage her intelligence for advantage. That restraint spoke louder than any display ever could. It suggested a self-assurance, grounded in knowledge rather than approval. In that realization, respect took on a different meaning. It was no longer tied to position or power, but to substance. Her mastery of language represented years of discipline, curiosity, and quiet effort, things money could not shortcut. He understood, perhaps for the first time, that genuine respect is not something granted by hierarchy. It is something compelled by depth. The contrast between them was impossible to ignore. His respect had often been borrowed, reinforced by circumstance. Hers was intrinsic, built through effort and carried without announcement. She did not command attention, yet she held it effortlessly. There was integrity in the way she carried herself, a consistency between who she was and how she acted that made pretense impossible. As he sat there, the weight of that truth settled in. He realized how rarely he had felt this kind of respect unforced, unearned by status, born purely from admiration. It humbled him. It challenged the framework through which he had measured people for years. She moved on to her next table, leaving him with a clearer understanding of something he had long overlooked. Respect, he saw now, was not assumed through wealth or demanded through power. It emerged quietly when skill met humility, when ability stood on its own without asking to be seen. And in recognizing that, he found himself changed, not elevated, but grounded, aware that true worth announces itself not with noise, but with undeniable presence. What lingered after that brief exchange was not the shock of surprise, but a slow, steady pull of curiosity that refused to fade. It was unfamiliar territory for him. He was used to fascination that burned fast and disappeared just as quickly, usually rooted in novelty or admiration directed toward him. This was different. It moved inward rather than outward, drawing his attention back to her even when she was no longer in front of him. He found himself watching her without meaning to, not in a possessive way, but with genuine interest. The way she carried herself remained unchanged, untouched by the moment they had shared. She moved through the cafe with the same quiet focus, offering the same polite smiles, never once glancing in his direction to gauge his reaction. That indifference unsettled him more than any display of confidence could have. It suggested that what had just occurred mattered far less to her than it did to him. As time passed, he began to notice the subtleties he had overlooked before. The patience in her tone when customers struggled to explain themselves, the intelligence behind her restraint, choosing when to speak and when to remain silent. Her presence felt steady, grounded, as though she was anchored by something internal rather than influenced by the shifting dynamics around her. It was not just her intellect that intrigued him, but the discipline with which she carried it. For the first time, he felt the urge to know someone without controlling the terms of the interaction. He did not want to impress her or dominate the conversation. He wanted to understand her perspective, the path that had shaped her into someone so capable yet so unassuming. The idea of connection began to form, not as a conquest or curiosity to be satisfied, but as a possibility rooted in mutual recognition. What made this connection feel different was the absence of imbalance. She had not been elevated by his attention, nor diminished by his wealth. Their brief exchange had placed them on equal ground, defined by shared understanding rather than social position. That equality was rare in his world, and it carried a quiet appeal. It promised something more honest than the relationships he was accustomed to, where power often distorted intention. Even as she continued her work, the space between them felt charged with unspoken potential, not romance in its immediate, dramatic sense, but the beginning of something more enduring, a respect-driven curiosity that invited patience. He sensed that approaching her would require sincerity rather than confidence, listening rather than leading. The realization was both unsettling and refreshing. When their eyes finally met again, it was brief and ordinary. No lingering glance, no acknowledgement of significance. Yet in that small moment, something solidified. The connection forming was not fueled by fantasy, but by authenticity. It was the understanding that whatever might grow between them would need to be built slowly, on equal footing. As he prepared to leave, he carried that awareness with him. The encounter had not given him answers, only an opening, a sense that he had crossed paths with someone who could not be impressed, only understood. And in that realization, he felt the quiet beginning of a bond, shaped not by power or status, but by shared respect, a foundation strong enough to hold whatever the future might allow.